There are women in the long history of Japanese literature who have been remembered not for their beauty alone, though beauty they had in abundance, and not for their intelligence alone, though their intelligence was of the kind that illuminates everything it touches, but for something more difficult to name, something that lives in the space between feeling and action, between what is experienced and what is expressed, and the woman known to history as Rokujo no Miyasudokoro. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro was among the most extraordinary of these women, a figure whose presence in the Tale of Genji burns with an intensity that the centuries have not dimmed. She was a woman of the highest rank, the widow of a former togu, a woman whose position in the world was defined by the most elevated connections that Heian court could offer, and yet her story is not the story of elevation, but of something more complicated and more human, the story of a love that was not returned in the measure it was given, of a pride so complete that it could not bend without breaking, and of emotions so powerful that they escaped the boundaries of the self entirely and moved through the world with a force that no act of will could contain or recall. The court of Heian Japan was a world unto itself, a world in which the physical and the spiritual were not cleanly separated, in which the inner life of a person could manifest in the outer world in ways that the modern mind struggles to accommodate, in which the intensity of an emotion could take on a reality beyond the merely subjective and act upon others with consequences that were as real as any physical force. Into this world Rokujo no Miyasudokoro had been born and educated and formed, a woman of exceptional gifts raised in exceptional circumstances, trained in every art that the court valued, poetry and music and the appreciation of beauty in its most refined forms, and she had married young, as women of her rank did, and the man she had married was Miko, the heir apparent, a man of corresponding gifts and corresponding position, and for a time it had seemed that her life would follow the path that her birth and her abilities had prepared for her. But Togu died. He died young, before the destiny that his position promised could be fulfilled, and the woman who had been his consort was left in the particular kind of isolation that widowhood creates for a woman of high rank in a court society, an isolation that is not poverty or obscurity, but something in some ways harder, the isolation of someone whose position is defined by a relationship that no longer exists, whose identity has been shaped by a connection that has been severed, who must find a way to continue in a world that has been organized around an absence. She had a daughter, a girl of considerable gifts, who would in time become a significant figure in her own right, and the care of this daughter gave her life a structure and a purpose that the loss of her husband had disrupted, and she continued, as people do, managing the household and the relationships and the social obligations that her rank required, navigating the complicated world of Heian court with the skill that her intelligence and her training had given her. It was in this state, in this widowhood, that was not quite grief and not quite recovery, but something suspended between the two, that she encountered Hikaru Genji, the shining Miko, the son of the Tenno, by a beloved concubine who had died when he was very young, a man whose beauty and whose gifts were spoken of throughout the capital in terms that suggested something beyond the merely human, a man who moved through the world of the court, leaving behind him a trail of attachments and complications that his own nature seemed unable to prevent, and his own will seemed unable to control. Genji was younger than Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro by some years, a gap that in the context of their society and their situation carried a particular weight, and the attachment that developed between them was from the beginning unequal in ways that would matter greatly, an attachment in which the intensity was not distributed evenly, in which one person gave more than the other could receive, in which the disproportion between what was offered and what was returned created a slow and almost invisible damage that would eventually become catastrophic. He was drawn to her, genuinely and in ways that were not simply calculated, and the early period of their connection had a quality that both of them might, in later and quieter moments, have recognized as something real, something that deserved a better outcome than the one it received. But Genji was not a man capable of the kind of singular devotion that Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro's nature required, not because he was without feeling, but because his feelings were too easily and too completely engaged by whatever beauty or sorrow or intelligence presented itself to him, because the capacity for attachment that made him so compelling to others also made him constitutionally unable to give any one person what that person deserved, and Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro was a person who deserved a great deal. She understood this about him, or came to understand it, and the understanding did not make things easier but harder, because understanding a situation and being able to accept it are not the same thing, and Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro was not a woman built for acceptance of what her intelligence told her she could not change. Her pride was immense, the kind of pride that is not simply vanity, but something closer to a fundamental orientation toward the world, an inability to occupy a position of less than full dignity, an unwillingness to be seen in want or in need, or in the vulnerability that love creates when it is not fully returned. She concealed her feelings with the skill that her training and her rank required of her, presented to the world the face that the world was permitted to see, maintained the composure that her position demanded, and inside the carefully constructed exterior, she experienced what she experienced, which was the full force of an attachment to a man who would not give her what she needed, and could not be made to understand what that need was. The visits that Genji paid her became less frequent, as his visits to women he was attached to always became less frequent over time, because the arc of his attachments was reliably the same, intense at the beginning, and gradually attenuating as the novelty gave way to the familiar, and the familiar gave way to the sense that something else, somewhere else, was more urgently calling him. Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro experienced this attenuation with all the acuity that her intelligence brought to everything she experienced, felt each lengthening interval between his visits as precisely what it was, a withdrawal, a diminishment, a communication made without words about the relative weight she occupied in his attention and his concern. And alongside this experience of being gradually valued less by the person whose valuation mattered most to her, there was another experience, which was the awareness of his other attachments, the knowledge that was impossible to fully conceal in the intimate world of Heian Court, that Genji was giving to others what he was withholding from her, was finding in younger and less complicated women something that her own complexity and her own demands perhaps made difficult to sustain. There was a woman called Aoi, Lady Aoi, who was Genji's principal wife, the daughter of Sadaijin, a woman of high rank and considerable dignity, who had married Genji in the formal arrangement that such marriages were in Heian society, a union of families as much as of persons, conducted with all the ceremony that the court prescribed for such occasions. The relationship between Genji and Aoi was not a warm one, was in fact characterized by a distance and a mutual unease that the formal circumstances of their marriage had never fully overcome, and yet Aoi occupied a position in Genji's life that Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro could not occupy, the position of acknowledged wife, of the woman whose place was secure regardless of the temperature of the connection. The tension between these two women, the official wife and the former Togu's widow, was not the simple tension of rivals competing for the same man, though there was certainly an element of that, but something more complicated, a tension between different kinds of position and different kinds of claim, between the formal and the emotional, between what the court recognized and what the heart required. It came to a crisis at a public event, the Kamo Festival, one of the great ceremonial occasions of Heian court calendar, an occasion at which rank and position were displayed and asserted in the arrangement of carriages along the route of the procession, in who was seen where, in the visible hierarchies that such occasions made legible to everyone who attended. The attendance of Aoi's carriage and the attendance of Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro's carriage came into conflict over position, over the physical space in which the carriages were to be placed, and the conflict was not simply a dispute between servants, but a statement, made in the language that the court understood, about whose claim to precedence was to be recognized, and whose was to be set aside. The attendance of Aoi prevailed, and the carriage of Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro was pushed aside, damaged in the process, forced to a position of ignominy that made visible to everyone present the relative weight that the two women occupied in the world that mattered to both of them. The humiliation was complete and public and understood by everyone who witnessed it in precisely the terms in which it was intended, and Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro sat in her damaged carriage at the side of the road and watched the procession pass, and watched Genji pass within it, and what she felt in that moment is one of those things that the narrative of the Tale of Genji renders with a precision and an understanding of the human heart that justifies the work's reputation as among the greatest ever written. She felt humiliated, but the humiliation was the smaller part of it. What she felt more deeply was the particular anguish of having been made visible in her vulnerability, of having had displayed before the eyes of the world the precise nature of her position, which was the position of someone who had given much and received less in return, who had committed herself to an attachment that the world could see was not reciprocated in the way that would have protected her from exactly this kind of exposure. And she felt something else, something that she may not have named clearly even to herself in that moment, but that the narrative makes visible, which was a rage that went beyond what could be expressed or acted upon through any of the means available to a woman of her position, a rage that had nowhere to go in the ordinary world of action and speech and gesture. The feelings that had nowhere to go went somewhere else. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary passages in the Tale of Genji, and one of the most extraordinary passages in the literature of any culture that attempts to render the inner life with honesty and precision, which is that Rokujo no Miyasudokoro's spirit, her living spirit, detached itself from her body and went to where Aoi was and attacked her. This is the phenomenon that the Japanese tradition calls Ikiryu, the living spirit, a manifestation of the idea that the emotions of the living can become so powerful that they escape the boundaries of the self and act independently in the world, and in the context of the Tale of Genji, it is presented not as a supernatural intrusion into an otherwise realistic narrative, but as a natural extension of the emotional reality of the situation, as what happens when feeling reaches a certain intensity and has no other outlet. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro did not know, at first, that this was happening. She had dreams, disturbing dreams, dreams in which she seemed to be somewhere other than her bed, dreams in which she felt the fabric of something beautiful beneath her hands, and felt herself speaking words she would not, waking, have spoken. She woke from these dreams troubled and uncertain, with a sense of having done something she could not account for, and the unease that followed her through her waking hours had the quality of a guilt without a clear object. And then she noticed something, which was that the perfume of her robes, the distinctive scent that clung to the clothing of a person of her rank and her refinement, a scent that was as individual as a face or a voice in the intimate world of Heian court, had begun to appear in her dreams in ways that connected it to the place she seemed to be going, and the connection frightened her in a way that nothing in her waking experience had frightened her, because what it implied was not simply that she was dreaming, but that something of her was leaving her body and going somewhere and doing something that her waking self had not authorized and could not control. Aoi was ill, was in the grip of a possession that the physicians and the monks brought to attend her could not remedy, a possession that manifested in ways that the court recognized and feared, in which the voice that came from the sick woman's mouth was not her own voice, in which the words spoken were not the words of the woman who lay suffering, but of something that had taken up residence in her body and was using it to express what could not be expressed through ordinary means. Genji came to sit with Aoi, came with the concern that the situation of a sick wife demanded, and what happened in those vigils by her bedside is one of the scenes that the Tale of Genji renders with a complexity that resists simple moral interpretation, in which the voice that came from Aoi was the voice of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, in which the spirit that had left Miyasudokoro's sleeping body found itself speaking through the woman it had come to harm, found itself saying to Genji things that Miyasudokoro's waking pride would never have permitted her to say, the things that the attachment had generated and the pride had suppressed, and the rage had finally forced out through a channel that bypassed all the defenses that consciousness maintains. She spoke of love, the spirit did, in the possessed woman's body, of a love that had been given and not adequately returned, of the pain that the inadequacy had caused, of the humiliation at the festival that had been one humiliation among many, but had perhaps been the one that finally exceeded what could be contained. Genji listened, and what he heard moved him in ways that his ordinary dealings with Miyasudokoro had not always managed to move him, because the voice that spoke was stripped of the composure and the control that Miyasudokoro maintained in her waking life was the voice of the feeling itself, rather than the feeling as mediated by intelligence and pride, and the requirements of dignity, and the feeling, heard directly, was unmistakable in its depth and its sincerity. He spoke to the spirit gently, called it by Miyasudokoro's name, acknowledged what it said with a tenderness that he had not always shown in the ordinary course of their relationship, and the spirit responded, and the exchange that took place at the bedside of the suffering Aoi had a quality that the relationship between Genji and Miyasudokoro in its ordinary form had perhaps never quite achieved, a quality of directness and honesty that the layers of court convention and personal pride had consistently prevented. But the tenderness came too late for Aoi, who did not survive, who died in the aftermath of the possession with the child she had been carrying, leaving Genji with the complicated grief of losing a wife with whom he had never been fully at ease, and the complicated guilt of knowing something about what had brought her to this end. And Rokujo no Miyasudokoro woke from her dreams and understood more clearly what she had been and what she had done, and the understanding did not bring her peace but something far more difficult, the knowledge that the emotions she had believed she was containing had not been contained at all, that what she had felt had moved through the world and done damage that could not be undone, that she was not only the victim of a love imperfectly returned, but the instrument of a harm she had not consciously chosen and could not now recall. The horror of this knowledge is something the tale of Genji conveys without simplifying it, without making Rokujo no Miyasudokoro simply a villain or simply a victim, without resolving the moral complexity of a situation in which genuine suffering produces genuine harm through a process that bypasses the will entirely, in which the person who causes the damage is also the person who is damaged, in which guilt and grief and love and rage are so thoroughly entangled that separating them is impossible. She withdrew from Genji after this, pulled back from the connection with a definitiveness that her earlier attempts at distance had not achieved, and the withdrawal was not simply the withdrawal of a woman who had been humiliated and was protecting what remained of her pride, but the withdrawal of someone who had glimpsed something in herself that frightened her, who had seen the force that her feelings could generate when they had nowhere else to go, and who understood that the only way to prevent further harm was to remove herself from the situation that was generating the feelings. Part 2. She began to speak of leaving the capital, of accompanying her daughter to Ise, where the daughter had been appointed as the Ise Virgin, the sacred attendant at the great shrine. The appointment was an honor, a significant religious and ceremonial role, but it also required the Virgin and those attending her to leave the capital and the court for a period of years, to remove themselves from the world of political and romantic entanglement to the relative simplicity of sacred service. For Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, this departure offered something that the honor of the appointment alone could not have made sufficient reason to undertake the considerable disruption that leaving the capital would involve, which was distance, physical distance, from Genji and from everything that being near Genji produced in her. Genji, when he understood that she was seriously considering the departure, responded in ways that were characteristic of him, with a renewed attention and a renewed tenderness, that had the quality of something retrieved rather than something sustained, an affection that intensified precisely when the possibility of loss made itself felt, as though the threat of absence clarified a value that ordinary presence had obscured. He came to her more frequently in the period before the departure. He wrote with a frequency and a feeling that recalled the earlier, more intense phase of their connection. He expressed, with the eloquence that was among his most considerable gifts, something of what she meant to him, something of the regret he felt for the ways in which he had not been adequate to what their connection deserved. And Rokujo no Miyasudokuro received these attentions with the complicated feelings of someone who has been waiting for exactly this, and has learned, through the waiting, to distrust it when it comes, who understands that the intensification of Genji's feeling is connected to the threat of her departure, and would likely attenuate again if the departure were abandoned and ordinary proximity were restored. She did not abandon the departure. The decision was not made without pain, was not made without the full awareness of what she was leaving behind. Not only Genji himself, but the capital that was the center of the world she had been formed in, the court and its culture and its beauty, the poetry and the music and the refined appreciation of the seasons that were the substance of the life she had lived. But she had also glimpsed, in the episode of the possession, something about what that life had cost her, something about what proximity to Genji and the feelings that proximity generated had done and would continue to do if she remained. And the glimpse was enough to make the leaving possible, even though it was not enough to make it easy. The preparations for the departure to Ise were elaborate and ceremonially significant, as befitted the occasion of a sacred appointment, and they occupied weeks of planning and ceremony, and the kind of formal leave-taking that the court prescribed for such occasions, during which Rokujo no Miyasudokuro moved through the prescribed rituals with the composure that had always been her public face, receiving the visits and the poems and the expressions of regret that the court offered, responding with the grace and the wit that her position required. Genji came to the farewell gathering, and the exchange that took place between them on that occasion is rendered in the Tale of Genji with a particular attention that suggests Murasaki Shikibu understood it as one of the defining moments of their relationship, a moment in which everything that had been felt and not said and not meant was compressed into the space of a brief encounter with the whole court as witness. They exchanged poems, as the convention of the court required on such occasions, poems in which the conventions of seasonal imagery and classical allusion carried the weight of what could not be directly expressed, and the poems they exchanged were, by the standards of the court that heard them, among the finest that either of them had written, which was itself a kind of statement about what the occasion and the relationship had cost both of them. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro left the capital with her daughter, traveling to Ise in the procession appropriate to the occasion, and the capital receded behind her, and Genji stood among those who watched the procession depart, and felt, as he often felt too late, the full weight of what was leaving. Ise was a different world from the capital, a world organized around the rhythms of sacred service rather than the rhythms of court life, quieter and more austere, less given to the elaborate social performance that the capital required, and Rokujo no Miyasudokuro settled into this different world, with the adaptability that her intelligence had always given her. The years in Issei were not unhappy years, or not simply unhappy. There was a quality of relief in the distance, a quality of breathing more freely without the constant pressure of proximity to Genji, and everything that proximity generated. The letters continued to come from the capital, from Genji, who did not forget her even in the absence, and who expressed what he felt with the eloquence that was always available to him. And she read these letters with the complicated feelings of someone who loves and cannot stop loving, and knows that the love is not a simple source of happiness, but something more difficult and more durable than happiness. She wrote back, because not to write back was not among the options available to someone of her gifts and her position, and the letters she wrote were what her letters had always been, precise and beautiful and carefully controlled, expressing the feeling and containing it simultaneously, showing and concealing in the same gesture. Her daughter fulfilled her sacred duties with the seriousness that the role required, and Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro supported and guided her through the years of that service with the devotion of a mother who has given much of her own life to the question of her daughter's well-being and future. But she was not well. The years had taken something from her that distance and relief could not restore, and the illness that began in Issei was not the illness of a body simply failing, but of something more comprehensive, a depletion that was physical and something more than physical, as though the intensity of what she had felt and the horror of what she had done had used up a resource that could not be replenished. She would return to the capital before the end. She would see Genji again, and what remained between them in that final meeting would be both less and more than what had been there at the beginning. Less in the sense that so much had been spent, more in the sense that what remained had been refined by everything it had survived. She would return to the capital before the end. She would see Genji again. And what remained between them in that final meeting would be both less and more than what had been there at the beginning. Less in the sense that so much had been spent, more in the sense that what remained had been refined by everything it had survived. But before that return, before the final meeting and the dying that followed it, there were the years of Issei themselves, years that the tale renders with a quality of suspension, of a life paused between one chapter and the next, and those years had their own texture, their own particular combination of relief and loss, and the strange experience of being outside the world that had formed you, and finding that the outside has a different kind of clarity than the inside ever offered. The sacred duties of the Issei shrine governed the rhythms of life there with a regularity that the court world, for all its ceremonial elaboration, did not quite match, a regularity that came from the natural world rather than from the human one, from the movements of the seasons and the requirements of the rituals that marked them, and Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro found in this regularity something that she had not known she was missing, a relationship to time that did not depend on the calculations of human desire and human preference and human inconstancy. The seasons at Issei had their own beauty, less curated than the capital's, more immediate and directly available. The sea was nearby, its sound present in the background of every day, something the court world had not prepared her for, and that she found unexpectedly to be something she needed. She wrote poems at Issei, as she had always written poems, but the poems she wrote there had a different quality from those she had written in the capital, were less densely elusive, less layered with the classical references that the court poetry valued, more directly engaged with what was immediately present, the sea and the wind and the particular quality of the light on the water in the early morning. Genji read these poems in the capital and felt in them something of what she had found in Ise, and his responses were among the more honest things he wrote during those years, less shaped by the performance of feeling and more directly responsive to what he had actually received. The correspondence itself was a form of the connection maintained across distance, and Rokujo no Miyasudokoro could write to Genji with a fullness and a precision that the conventions of the classical form both required and enabled, could say in the carefully constructed language of the poem what she could not have said in direct speech, could allow the feeling to be visible in the art, without requiring the art to give way entirely to the feeling. And Genji could receive what she sent with an appreciation that the distance made easier to sustain than proximity had always made it, could respond with the tenderness that absence reliably evoked in him, could be, in the exchange of letters across the distance between the capital and Ise, something closer to what she needed him to be than he had managed to be when they were in the same city. This is one of the more melancholy things about their story, that the relationship was in some ways better at a distance than it had been close, that the form most adequate to what they were to each other was the form of letters exchanged across a separation that neither of them had fully chosen, and that both of them, in their different ways, regretted. The departure from the capital was an occasion of considerable ceremony, as befitted the sacred nature of the appointment and the rank of those undertaking the journey, and Genji attended the formal leave-taking with the renewed attention that the proximity of loss always provoked in him, with the poems and the gestures of regret that the occasion demanded, and that, on this occasion, contained something more than the performed feeling that such occasions sometimes produced. He had come to understand, in the weeks before the departure, something about what her presence in the capital had meant to him, that ordinary proximity had made difficult to see clearly. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro was a fixed point in the court's constellation of intelligence and beauty, a presence whose quality was so consistently maintained that it could be taken for granted in the way that fixed things are taken for granted, and the imminent removal of the fixed point made visible the weight it had been carrying in his sense of the world around him. He wrote her a poem on the night before the departure that was among the finest things he had written, a poem in which the classical imagery of autumn leaves and parting geese carried the weight of a feeling more direct and more unguarded than his correspondence with her usually achieved, and she read it in the quiet of her room on that last night in the capital, and held it for a long time before she wrote her answer. Her answer was precise and beautiful and contained, as her answers always were, the feeling and the management of the feeling simultaneously, the expression and the restraint in the same gesture, and it was perhaps the most complete expression of what she was that the constraints of the form could accommodate, which is to say, it was a masterpiece of the art she had spent her life developing, and it was not enough, and she knew it was not enough, and she sent it anyway, because sending it was what was available to her. The road to Ise was long, and the procession moved slowly, as such processions did, through landscapes that changed as the capital fell away behind them, and the country opened into something less organized by human intention, and more directly shaped by the forces that the court appreciated in poetry, and at a distance, but rarely encountered so immediately. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro traveled in the formal carriage appropriate to her rank, and the journey gave her hours of the particular kind of thinking that travel produces, the thinking that is neither purposeful nor idle, but moves with the rhythm of the movement, following associations and memories and possibilities through the landscape of the mind, in the same way the procession moved through the landscape of the country. She thought of the festival, of the carriage at the side of the road, of the face she had presented to the world in that moment of humiliation, and the face she had been unable to present, the face that had gone somewhere else entirely and done what it had done. She thought of Aoi, who was dead. She thought of Genji at the bedside, speaking to the voice that came through Aoi's suffering mouth, with a tenderness he had not always brought to her directly. She thought of the dreams, of the perfume on her robes, of the morning unease that had told her something was wrong before she had the words for what it was. She thought of what it meant to be someone whose feelings were capable of that, of escaping the body and moving through the world and doing damage that the will had not authorized and could not recall. She did not arrive at a comfortable understanding, because there was no comfortable understanding available. She arrived at something more modest and more honest, which was the acknowledgement that she was not only the person she had believed herself to be, not only the composed and intelligent and beautifully managed surface, but also the force that had moved beneath the surface and had found its own outlet when the surface could no longer contain it. Issei received her, and the years there passed in their own rhythm, different from anything the capital had offered, and she found in that difference something she had not expected, which was that the self that had been formed in the capital, the self that was defined by its relationships to the people and the culture of the court, was not the only self available to her, that the distance had made possible a kind of reflection on that formed self that proximity had never allowed. She was still Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, still the widow of Togu, still a woman of the highest rank and the most refined gifts, but she was also, in Issei, simply a person in a landscape, a person whose feelings were her own, and not a position in a social configuration, whose intelligence was hers to use as she chose, and not a performance for an audience that was always evaluating. The poems she wrote in those years, the letters she sent to the capital, the conversations she had with her daughter as the girl grew into the responsibilities of the sacred role she had been appointed to, all of these were the expressions of a woman who had, in the space that Issei offered, found something of herself that the court world had not quite allowed her to find, some dimension of her own experience that the constant management of surfaces had kept from view. She was not happy in any simple sense. The love that had brought her to this distance was still present in her, was not resolved by the distance and not diminished in any fundamental way, and the letters from the capital arrived with a regularity that kept the connection alive, even as it kept the feeling alive, kept the question of what might have been from settling into the acceptance that might have made the distance easier. But she was, in Issei, more fully herself than she had been able to be in the capital. and the fullness had a quality that she recognized as valuable, even though it had cost her everything that the capital represented to get there. Part 3. The return from Issei was the return of a woman who had changed, not in the fundamental nature of her character, for Rokujo no Miyasu Dokoro was too completely herself for any experience to alter what was essential about her, but in the relationship between that character and the world she inhabited, a relationship that had been recalibrated by the years of absence and illness, and the sustained experience of living at a distance from everything that had defined her. She was ill when she returned, more seriously ill than the capital understood at first, because she carried her illness with the same composure that she carried everything else, did not display it in ways that would have invited sympathy or concern, and the court that received her back saw what she permitted them to see, which was a woman of somewhat diminished vitality, but still formidable presence, still in possession of the beauty and the intelligence and the precise social gifts that had always distinguished her. Genji came to see her, because Genji always came when the occasion seemed to require it, and the meeting between them was the meeting of two people who had known each other in a context of considerable intensity and were now encountering each other in a different context, older and more aware of what had passed between them and what that passage had cost. What passed between them in that meeting is rendered in the Tale of Genji with a delicacy that reflects both the genuine feeling involved and the complicated nature of a connection that had never been simple and was now freighted with everything that had happened, with the possession and the death of Aoi, and the years of separation and the illness, and the accumulated weight of feelings that had been felt and expressed and felt again, without ever reaching the resolution that either of them might have wished. Genji looked at her and saw someone who had been magnificent and was still magnificent, but was also clearly diminished, and the sight moved him with a tenderness that came too late, as his tenderness so often came, moved him with a regret for the inadequacy of what he had given her, and a renewed appreciation for the quality of what she had given him, which had always been considerable, and was now, in the clarity of her illness, unmistakable. She looked at him and saw what she had always seen, the beauty and the gifts and the fundamental instability of his affections, the man who was genuinely moved by what moved him, and genuinely limited by what limited him, and she received his renewed attention with the grace that had always been her public face, while somewhere beneath that grace she continued to feel what she had always felt, which was a love that the years and the distance and the horror of what the love had done had not diminished as much as she might have hoped. They exchanged poems. They spoke of the past with the careful indirection that their shared history and their shared awareness of what that history contained required. And the visit ended, as visits ended, and Genji left, and Rokujo no Miyasu Dokoro continued her dying. Because that is what she was doing, though neither she nor anyone around her said it in those terms for some time. The illness that had begun in Issei and accompanied her back to the capital was the illness of someone whose vital resources had been exhausted by something that went beyond the physical, and the careful management of its symptoms could not address what was actually happening, which was a withdrawal from life that had the quality of a decision, even if it was not consciously made as one. She called Genji to her bedside when she understood that the end was approaching, and the scene that the Tale of Genji renders at that bedside is among the most emotionally complex in the entire work, a scene in which dying and love and guilt and grief and the particular kind of clarity that dying sometimes produces are all present simultaneously and refuse to separate into anything simpler. She spoke to him of her daughter, asked him to care for the girl after she was gone, asked him to continue the support and the attention that a powerful patron could provide to a young woman navigating the court alone, and Genji promised, as he always promised, with the sincerity of feeling that was never in question, and the reliability that was always somewhat more complicated. She spoke of the possession, obliquely, with the indirection that the gravity of the subject and the requirements of her own dignity demanded, acknowledging without precisely naming the thing that had happened and the harm that it had caused, and in the acknowledgment there was something that was not quite an apology, but contained the substance of one, a recognition that what had moved through the world from her had done damage, and that she carried the knowledge of that damage with her. Genji received what she said with the tenderness that he was genuinely capable of, and that the dying woman before him genuinely evoked, and spoke of his own failures in the register of a man who understood, in this final encounter, something of what he had not understood adequately before, which was the full cost of what his inconstancy had exacted from someone who had not been built for the casual relationships that his nature required. She died with the composure that had been her signature throughout her life, died in the way that her character demanded, without the dramatic expressions of regret or desire that a lesser person might have produced in those final hours, and the court mourned her with the genuine respect that her rank and her gifts had earned, and Genji mourned her with the complicated grief of someone who understood that what had passed was irreplaceable, and that his own behavior had been among the instruments of its loss. Her daughter, the former Issei virgin, returned to the capital after her mother's death, and navigated the complex world of the court with the gifts and the difficulties that being Rokujo no Miyasudokoro's daughter entailed, and Genji fulfilled his promise of patronage with more consistency than he had fulfilled some of his other promises, which was perhaps his way of making good on what had been inadequate before. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro herself was gone, the living woman was gone, and what remained was the memory and the reputation and the complicated legacy of a life that had been extraordinary in its gifts, and extraordinary in its suffering, and extraordinary in the way those two things had been connected, each intensifying the other, the gifts making the suffering more acute, because the intelligence that was among the gifts could not prevent the heart from feeling what it felt, and the suffering generating in turn a force that the gifts could not fully contain or redirect. But she was not entirely gone. This is the part of the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro that distinguishes it from the story of simply a gifted and unfortunate woman, that makes it something stranger and more enduring than a tale of love and loss, which is that her spirit continued to manifest in the world after her death in ways that her living spirit had manifested, continued to affect those around Genji with the force that her feelings had always generated. The dead, in the world of the Tale of Genji, are not simply absent. They remain connected to the world of the living through the intensity of the feelings that bound them to it, and a woman who had felt what Rokujo no Miyasudokoro had felt, and who had felt it in the particular way that she had felt, it was not a woman whose death resolved the emotional situation that her life had created. The spirit that had left her body in life and gone to where Aoi was suffering continued to leave its mark on the world after the body that had housed it was gone, continued to seek what it had sought in life, continued to feel what it had felt, and the women who came into Genji's life after Miyasudokoro's death would discover that she was not as absent from it as the fact of her death might have suggested. There was a woman called Murasaki, the woman whom Genji had found as a child, and raised and shaped in ways that reflected his own desires and his own understanding of what a woman should be. A woman whose devotion to him was total, and whose beauty was of the kind that the court found most compelling. And Murasaki was the woman who would feel Miyasudokoro's continued presence most acutely, would find herself beset by an affliction that the monks and the healers who attended her could not remedy, and that the narrative makes clear is connected to the unquiet spirit of a woman who had loved and suffered and had not found in death the rest that her life had denied her. There was a woman called Murasaki, the woman whom Genji had found as a child, and raised and shaped in ways that reflected his own desires and his own understanding of what a woman should be, a woman whose devotion to him was total, and whose beauty was of the kind that the court found most compelling. And Murasaki was the woman who would feel Miyasudokoro's continued presence most acutely, would find herself beset by an affliction that the monks and the healers who attended her could not remedy, and that the narrative makes clear is connected to the unquiet spirit of a woman who had loved and suffered and had not found, in death, the rest that her life had denied her. The possession of Murasaki by the spirit of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro is one of the episodes in the Tale of Genji that most clearly demonstrates Murasaki Shikibu's understanding of the way that the inner life produces outer consequences, the way that unresolved feeling persists and acts in the world, regardless of whether the person who generated it is still living, the way that the dead are not simply absent, but continue to be present in the effects of what they felt, and what they did, and what was done to them. Murasaki fell ill in ways that the court recognized as possession, fell ill with the symptoms that Heian understanding of such things associated with a spirit that had taken up residence in a body not its own, and the healers who were summoned performed the exorcisms and the rituals that the tradition prescribed, and the spirit that spoke through Murasaki's suffering mouth spoke in ways that identified it, for those who listened carefully, as the spirit of a woman who had been wronged by a love imperfectly returned, and who had not yet found a way to release what she carried. Genji attended the sickbed of Murasaki as he had attended the sickbed of Aoi, and the parallel was not lost on him, the recognition that the pattern of his life was generating consequences that reached beyond his own experience and affected the women around him with a force he had not fully reckoned with, that the feelings his inconstancy had produced in others were not simply their feelings, contained within their experience, and resolved by time and distance, but something that persisted and acted in the world in ways he had not anticipated and could not control. He spoke to the spirit that spoke through Murasaki with the same tenderness and the same regret that he had brought to the bedside of Aoi, acknowledged what it said, tried to offer what comfort the acknowledgement of wrong can offer, and the spirit spoke of love and of pain and of the impossibility of releasing what had been so completely given and so incompletely received. Murasaki survived this possession, survived it in the sense that the immediate crisis passed, and she returned to something resembling health, but the experience left its mark on her in ways that health is not fully able to address, left her with the knowledge of what had been living in the vicinity of her life with Genji, the knowledge of what his history contained and what that history was still generating. And she understood, from the possession and from everything she had learned about Rokujo no Miyasudokuro in the years she had been part of Genji's world, something about her own situation that the intensity of her devotion to him had perhaps made it difficult to see clearly before, which was that the position she occupied in his life, however central and however loved, was not a position of simple security, but was surrounded by the complicated legacy of everything he had felt and done before, a legacy that was not resolved by his feeling for her and was not fully under his control. There was also a woman called Onna Sanomiya, a young woman of the imperial family, whom Genji had accepted as a wife late in his life, an acceptance motivated less by personal feeling than by the obligations of rank and the request of Inomikado, who wished to ensure his daughter's security by placing her under Genji's protection. The Onna Sanomiya was young and not particularly accomplished, a woman whose gifts did not approach those of Murasaki or those of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, a woman who was, in the world of the tale, somewhat insufficient to the position she was being placed in, insufficient to the complexity of the household she was entering, and the complicated man she was marrying. And yet she was of imperial blood, and her rank made her, formally and in the eyes of the court, the principal wife, a position that displaced Murasaki from the centrality she had occupied for so long, and that Genji's genuine love for Murasaki had never been formalized in ways that would have protected her from exactly this kind of displacement. The arrival of Onna Sanomiya in Genji's household was a wound to Murasaki that her composure and her devotion to him could not fully conceal, a wound that his genuine distress at her pain and his genuine continuing love for her could not fully heal, and it was in the context of this wound, in the household reorganized around a new principal wife whom Genji did not particularly love, that the spirit of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro made its second significant appearance. The Onna Sanomiya was possessed. The spirit that afflicted her was the same spirit, the same force that had acted through living jealousy and had persisted after death into whatever form unresolved feeling takes when the body that housed it is gone, and its action on Onna Sanomiya had a quality of justice, or of something that resembles justice, without being precisely justice, in that it afflicted the woman whose formal position represented the kind of displacement that Miyasudokuro had herself experienced, whose rank had given her a place in Genji's world that Miyasudokuro's deeper feeling had never quite secured. The Onna Sanomiya survived her possession, but was permanently marked by it, took religious vows in its aftermath, withdrew from the world of the court, into a life of sacred devotion that removed her from the complications of the household she had been brought into, and her withdrawal was in some ways a relief to everyone involved, though the relief was shadowed by the awareness of what had brought it about. Genji, watching all of this, watching the spirit of a woman he had not loved adequately enough, continuing to act in the world of the living, continuing to affect those around him with the force of what she had felt, understood something about the nature of his own history that his earlier life had perhaps not fully clarified, which was that feelings do not simply pass away when the relationship that generated them changes or ends, that the women he had loved and not loved adequately enough had not simply accepted the inadequacy and moved on, but had carried what they felt in ways that persisted and acted, and were not resolved by his later good intentions or his genuine regret. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro had been the most extreme case of this persistence, her feelings the most extreme in their manifestation, but she was not the only case, and the pattern of his life had created a world in which the unresolved feelings of the past were a genuine presence in the present, acting on those around him with a force that love alone, even genuine love, was not sufficient to address. Genji, watching all of this, watching the spirit of a woman he had not loved adequately enough, continuing to act in the world of the living, continuing to affect those around him with the force of what she had felt, understood something about the nature of his own history that his earlier life had perhaps not fully clarified, which was that feelings do not simply pass away when the relationship that generated them changes or ends, that the women he had loved and not loved adequately enough had not simply accepted the inadequacy and moved on, but had carried what they felt in ways that persisted and acted, and were not resolved by his later good intentions or his genuine regret. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro had been the most extreme case of this persistence, her feelings the most extreme in their manifestation, but she was not the only case, and the pattern of his life had created a world in which the unresolved feelings of the past were a genuine presence in the present, acting on those around him with a force that love alone, even genuine love, was not sufficient to address. He thought of her often in those later years, thought of her with the particular quality of attention that regret generates, the attention that circles around what cannot be changed, and finds in each circuit something new to recognize about the nature of the loss, and the nature of the failure that produced it. He thought of the festival, of the carriage pushed aside, of the expression on her face as she watched the procession pass. He thought of the bedside of Aoi, of the voice that spoke through the suffering woman's mouth, of the things the voice had said that Miyasudokoro herself had never said directly in all the years of their connection. He thought of Issei, of the letters that had continued to arrive from the distance that she had put between herself and everything that proximity to him generated, letters that were as beautiful as anything she had written, and that contained in their beauty the same careful management of the feeling beneath, the same refusal to let the feeling appear unmediated, the same pride that made direct expression impossible, and made the indirection of art the only available channel. And he thought of the final meeting, of the woman who had returned from Issei, already diminished by what the years and the illness had taken from her, who had sat across from him with the composure that had always been her public face, and who had spoken of practical matters, of her daughter's future, of the obligations that her death would leave unmet, and who had only briefly, in the oblique register that was the only register available to her, acknowledged the thing that lay between them, the harm that her feelings had done, and the harm that his inconstancy had done, and the impossibility of fully accounting for either. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro understood, better than anyone else in Genji's world, the full cost of what his nature exacted from those around him, because she had paid that cost in the most extreme form available, had paid it not only in the suffering of unreturned love, but in the horror of discovering what that love had become when it had nowhere else to go. And Genji, to his credit, and within the limits of what his nature allowed, understood this about her, understood that what had happened between them was not simply a matter of his having preferred other women, or having been distracted by other attachments, but something that went to the center of what he was and what she was, and the impossibility of those two natures fully accommodating each other in a world that offered no structure adequate to what either of them actually needed. The structure that Heian Court offered was the structure of multiple relationships managed simultaneously, of love distributed across several women according to the complex calculations of rank and feeling and obligation and desire, and this structure was adequate for some of the people who inhabited it and inadequate for others, and Rokujo no Miyasudokuro was among those for whom it was most inadequate, whose nature required a singularity of focus that the structure did not provide, and that Genji's nature was not capable of supplying. Murasaki, who had known Miyasudokuro only through the spirit that had afflicted her, and through the stories and the poems and the reputation that Miyasudokuro had left behind, understood something about the woman from these indirect sources that she could not have understood from direct acquaintance, something about the particular quality of the suffering that unreturned love generates in a person of that completeness and that pride. Because Murasaki's own situation was not entirely unlike Miyasudokuro's, though it was different in important ways. She too had committed herself completely to a man whose affections were not organized around a single commitment. She too had experienced the displacement that Genji's attachments to other women created. She too had managed the experience with the composure that her training and her pride required, had presented to the world the face of a woman wholly devoted to a man who gave her less than her devotion deserved. The difference was that Murasaki survived, continued in the world longer than Miyasudokuro had continued, and the survival had its own costs and its own complications, its own relationship to the question of what it means to carry what cannot be put down without loss of self. When the possession came to her, when Miyasudokuro's spirit spoke through her, Murasaki heard in what was said something of what she herself had felt and not said, something of the feeling that the composure had contained, and that the art had given form to, and that still remained beneath the composure and the art, waiting for an occasion to be heard. The occasion that the possession provided was one she had not sought, and would not have chosen, and the hearing it allowed was not the hearing she would have wanted, was heard in extremity, and attributed to a dead woman's spirit, rather than acknowledged as also something she herself might have said. But it was heard, and the hearing had consequences of its own, changed something in the relationship between Genji and Murasaki, made visible between them a truth that the ordinary management of the surface had kept hidden. The truth was that she suffered. The truth was that the life she lived with him, however genuinely loved and however central to his emotional world, was also a life that exacted from her something that the love did not compensate for, that the displacement and the inadequacy and the knowledge of what she had given and what she had received in return created in her something that the composure managed but did not resolve. This is not a simple truth, and the tale of Genji does not present it as one. Murasaki genuinely loved Genji, and the love was not simply the suffering of someone who had been deceived, but the complex experience of someone who chose her attachments with full knowledge of what they entailed, and who continued to choose them, because the alternative, the withdrawal that Rokujo no Miyasudokuro had chosen, and that Oigimi would later choose, was not available to her or not chosen by her. She stayed in the world. She managed the surface. She continued to write the beautiful poems and to respond to the seasons with the precise appreciation that the court valued, and to be the person that Genji had shaped her to be, and that she had also, in some part that the shaping could not fully account for, chosen to be herself. And she carried what she carried, and the carrying cost her what it cost her, and when she died it was not in the dramatic fashion of a possession or a possession's victim, but in the quieter fashion of someone whose vital resources have been gradually consumed by the effort of carrying what cannot be put down, whose life has been spent on terms that were never quite adequate to what she had to give. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro and Murasaki are the two great figures in the tale of Genji who illuminate from different angles the same fundamental truth about the experience of loving more completely than one is loved in return, and the difference between them, the difference between Miyasudokuro's dramatic and destructive response and Murasaki's composed and ultimately fatal one, is not a difference between the right response and the wrong response, but a difference between two ways of being destroyed by the same situation. Part 4. To understand what Rokujo no Miyasudokuro means in the world of the tale of Genji, it is necessary to understand something about the world itself, about the particular conception of the relationship between the inner life and the outer world that Heian culture maintained, and that Murasaki Shikibu rendered with such extraordinary precision and such extraordinary sympathy. The Heian court was a world of surfaces, in the sense that the management of surfaces, the presentation of beauty and wit and emotional refinement to the world, was among its central preoccupations and among its highest achievements. Poetry and calligraphy and the appreciation of nature and the ability to respond to any situation with the appropriate blend of feeling and aesthetic understanding were the skills that the court valued most, were the skills through which identity was constructed and social position maintained, and the quality of a person's inner life was made legible to those around them. But the emphasis on surfaces did not mean that the inner life was denied or suppressed, and this is one of the most interesting things about the world that the tale of Genji depicts, that the cultivation of surfaces was understood as the cultivation of depths, that the person who could respond to the first cherry blossoms of spring with the perfect poem was understood to be demonstrating not simply a technical skill, but a genuine sensitivity to the transience and the beauty that the blossoms embodied. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro was exceptional in this world by every measure the world offered. Her poetry was among the finest that the court produced. Her understanding of music and of the other arts that the court valued was profound and original. Her ability to manage the surface of her emotional life, to present to the world the face of composure and dignity, regardless of what lay beneath, was itself a kind of art, practiced with the consistency and the precision that art requires. And yet the very depth of her inner life, the very intensity with which she felt everything that she felt, was the thing that ultimately exceeded the world's capacity to contain it, that broke through the surface of composure and acted in the world in the form of the living spirit, the force that visited Aoi and later Murasaki and Onasanomiya, and that could not be recalled or controlled by any act of will. This is one of the paradoxes that the Tale of Genji explores through the figure of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, the paradox that the person who is most gifted in the arts of emotional refinement and surface management is also the person whose inner life is most powerful and therefore most difficult to contain, that the cultivation of depth creates depth, that the person who feels most acutely is the person most at risk of the consequences of feeling. Genji himself understood this about her, or came to understand it, and his understanding came too late, as his understanding of many things came too late, but it came, and the regret that accompanied it was genuine, and was among the more honest emotions that the tale records him experiencing, a regret not for specific actions that could have been taken differently, but for the more fundamental incapacity that lay beneath those actions, the incapacity to give a person what that person deserved when the giving was possible. The question of what Genji deserved in return for what he experienced is one that the tale raises without answering, because the tale is too honest about the complexity of the situation to offer a simple moral accounting, too aware that Genji was not simply a villain who used women and discarded them, but a person of genuine gifts and genuine feeling, who was also genuinely limited in ways that caused real harm, that the harm and the gifts were connected in ways that resisted separation. He suffered. The narrative makes this clear. The losses that his life accumulated, the deaths of women he had loved, and the knowledge that his own inadequacy had contributed to some of those losses, produced in him a grief and a remorse that were real experiences and not simply performances of regret for the benefit of an audience. But his suffering did not cancel the suffering of those he had harmed, did not address the question of what was owed to Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, or to Aoi, or to Murasaki for what they had experienced because of what he was and what he had done, and the tale does not suggest that it does not offer the comfort of a moral symmetry in which his pain pays the debt his inconstancy incurred. What it offers instead is something more interesting and more honest, which is the full complexity of a situation in which good and bad are not simply distributed between different people, but are present together in the same person, in which the capacity for love and the capacity for harm are not opposites, but aspects of the same nature, in which the most beautiful things and the most damaging things can emerge from the same source. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro was the figure through whom this complexity was most fully explored, because she was the figure whose suffering was most clearly connected to her gifts, whose capacity for feeling was inseparable from the force that her feeling generated when it was not received in the measure it was given, whose story makes the most direct case for the proposition that the intensity of the inner life is both the source of what is most valuable about a person and the source of what is most dangerous. She was not a comfortable figure, not a figure who offered the reader the simple pleasures of a victim purely wronged or a villain purely at fault, but a figure of extraordinary complexity, a figure who demanded from the reader something of the same quality of attention and understanding that her own nature demanded from the world around her, the ability to hold multiple things simultaneously, to feel the genuine sympathy her suffering evoked while acknowledging the genuine harm her spirit caused, to understand the love and the rage and the pride and the horror as aspects of a single coherent experience, rather than as contradictions that needed to be resolved. She is, in many ways, the character in the Tale of Genji, whose modernity is most striking to readers who encounter her from a later perspective, not because her situation is modern, but because the honesty with which her inner life is rendered, the refusal to simplify or moralize or resolve the complexity of what she feels and what she does, has a quality that feels contemporary in its insistence on the irreducible difficulty of being a person with strong feelings in a world that cannot always accommodate them. Murasaki Shikibu herself was a woman of Heian court, a woman who had her own experiences of loss and of love imperfectly returned, and of the management of inner life within the constraints of a society that prescribed very carefully what could be expressed and how, and it is not difficult to feel in the figure of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro something of what its creator knew personally about the consequences of feeling too much in a world that did not always know how to receive it. The novel that contains her is often described as the world's first novel, and whether or not that description is precisely accurate, it is certainly one of the earliest works of sustained prose fiction to take the inner life of its characters as its primary subject, to be interested not simply in what people do, but in what they feel while they are doing it, and what the feeling costs them, and what it generates in those around them. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro is at the center of this project, because she is the character whose inner life most dramatically overflows into the outer world, whose feelings most clearly demonstrate the proposition that the inner and the outer are not cleanly separated, that what a person feels has consequences that extend beyond the merely subjective and act upon others in ways that cannot be fully anticipated or controlled. Her story begins with a love that was not returned in the measure it was given, proceeds through the horror of discovering what that unreturned love had generated, continues through the years of Issei and the illness that ended in death, and persists after death in the manifestations of a spirit that could not release what it had carried, and at every stage it illuminates something true about the relationship between feeling and action, between the inner life and the world that surrounds it. The specific qualities of Heian world in which this story is set, the elaborate ceremonial culture and the court poetry and the sensitivity to the natural world and the particular understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead are not incidental to the story, but essential to it, because they create the conditions under which the story is possible, the world in which it makes sense for the intensity of a woman's feeling to manifest as a living spirit, in which the dead continue to act in the world of the living, in which the management of the inner life is both an art and a necessity. But the story reaches beyond those specific conditions to something more universal, something about the experience of loving without adequate return, of being exceptionally gifted in a world that cannot fully accommodate exceptional gifts, of feeling with an intensity that the world around you is not prepared to receive, that resonates with readers far removed from the specifics of Heian court. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro is a figure of loss, of the loss of a husband who died young, and a love that was never returned in the measure it was given, and a life that was shaped by those losses in ways that her gifts and her pride could not prevent. But she is also a figure of endurance, of the persistence of feeling beyond the circumstances that generated it, of the refusal to release what has been completely given, even when the release would be the more comfortable option. Her spirit persists in the world of the tale long after her body is gone, continues to act and to affect and to make its presence felt, and this persistence is the most extreme version of something that the tale presents as a more general truth about the way that intense feeling continues in the world, the way that love and suffering do not simply end when the person who experienced them is gone, but leave traces that others live with and feel the effects of long after the source has passed. Her spirit persists in the world of the tale long after her body is gone, continues to act and to affect and to make its presence felt, and this persistence is the most extreme version of something that the tale presents as a more general truth about the way that intense feeling continues in the world, the way that love and suffering do not simply end when the person who experienced them is gone, but leave traces that others live with and feel the effects of long after the source has passed. There is something in the figure of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro that speaks to a particular kind of experience, the experience of being someone whose inner life exceeds the capacity of the world around them to receive it, whose feelings are larger than the forms available for their expression, whose love is more complete than the love that is returned to them. This is not a rare experience, and it is not an experience confined to the specific circumstances of Heian court, and it is perhaps one of the reasons why the Tale of Genji, written more than 1,000 years ago in a world utterly unlike our own, continues to be read and continues to resonate with readers who recognize in Rokujo no Miyasudokoro something of their own experience of loving and being loved imperfectly. The court of Heian Japan believed that poetry was the most adequate form for the expression of the inner life, that the compression of feeling into the 17 or 31 syllables of the classical forms was not a limitation, but an achievement, a demonstration that the feeling was real enough and refined enough to survive the discipline of form. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro was a master of this art, was among the finest poets at a court of fine poets, and her poems are among the most beautiful in the tale. But her story suggests that poetry was not, in the end, adequate to what she felt, that the feeling exceeded even the most refined and most beautiful forms available for its expression, that what she carried could not be fully contained by any art, however skilled, and the consequence of that excess was the living spirit, the force that bypassed the art entirely and acted directly in the world. This is one of the most interesting things that the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro suggests about the nature of feeling and the nature of art, that art is the attempt to give form to what exceeds form, that the value of art lies precisely in this attempt, and that the attempt can fail, that what exceeds form does not simply disappear when the art fails to contain it, but continues in the world in other ways, ways that are less beautiful and more dangerous than the art they circumvent. The beauty of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, the beauty of her poems and her music, and her management of every occasion with the precise grace that the court valued, was the beauty of a person who was always attempting to give form to what she felt, always trying to shape what was most powerful in her experience into something that the world could receive. And the horror of the living spirit was the failure of that attempt, the overflow of what could not be contained, the feeling that went where it went because it had nowhere else to go. In the context of the whole tale of Genji, the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro serves as a kind of warning and a kind of elegy simultaneously, a warning about the consequences of love imperfectly returned, and an elegy for the person who loved and was not fully received, and the warning and the elegy are given equal weight, are held in the same careful balance that Murasaki Shikibu maintains throughout the work, the refusal to reduce the complexity of human experience to any simpler moral than the complexity itself. What Rokujo no Miyasudokuro wanted was not complicated, in the sense that the desire itself was clear. She wanted to be loved in the measure that she loved, to have the depth of her feeling met with a corresponding depth, to occupy in the life of the person she had committed herself to a position commensurate with the completeness of that commitment. This is not an unusual desire. It is perhaps the most common desire that exists between people who love each other. What was complicated was the situation in which this desire was embedded, the specific person she had chosen to love, and the specific limitations of that person, and the specific world in which both of them were living, a world that made it structurally difficult for the desire to be satisfied, because it placed formal constraints on the relationship that worked against the informal reality of what she felt and what she needed. Genji could not make her his principal wife. His connections to Aoi, his formal wife, precluded it. His position in the court required the management of multiple relationships that the social structure of Heian society both demanded and enabled, and the management of those relationships was not simply a personal failing, but a structural feature of the world he inhabited. And yet the structural explanation does not fully account for what happened, does not address the question of whether a person with different qualities, with a different relationship to his own inconstancy, might have managed the situation with less damage. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro's story does not answer this question, and the tale of Genji does not answer it, because the tale is interested in the question rather than in the answer, in the full complexity of a situation that resists the simplifications that answers require. What the tale does offer, in place of an answer, is the full texture of the experience on both sides, the full weight of what was felt by the woman who loved too completely, and by the man who could not receive what was given, and by the women who were caught in the effects of what that incompleteness generated, and the offering of that full texture is the highest ambition of literature and the greatest achievement of the tale of Genji. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro loved Genji with the completeness of her nature, which was a very complete nature, and was not loved in return with a corresponding completeness, and what that inadequacy produced in her was first grief, and then pride, and then rage, and finally the force that expressed what could not be expressed through any of the ordinary channels that her world provided, and the force acted in the world and caused harm, and then continued after her death to cause more harm, and through all of it she remained herself, remained the extraordinary woman she had always been, refused to be diminished by what she suffered, even as she suffered it. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her, that the suffering and the horror did not diminish her, did not reduce her to simply a victim or simply a monster, but kept her always in the full complexity of what she was, a woman of immense gifts and immense feeling, a woman whose story illuminates something true and difficult and ultimately irreducible about the experience of being alive. She lives in the pages of a book written more than 1,000 years ago, and she is as present there as she has ever been, as immediate, as complex, as resistant to simple moral judgment as any figure in the literature of any language, and she is there because a woman named Murasaki Shikibu understood her well enough to render her fully, understood from the inside what it was to be someone whose feelings exceeded the capacity of the world to receive them, and put that understanding into the most beautiful and most enduring form available to her. The Lady of Rokujo, Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, the woman whose love was not returned in the measure it was given, and who did not forgive it, and who could not forget it, and who is not forgotten. The specific qualities of the inner life that Rokujo no Miyasudokuro possessed, the intensity of her feeling and the completeness of her commitment, and the pride that made direct expression impossible, these were qualities that Heian court recognized and valued in their aesthetic manifestations, while being poorly equipped to accommodate in their emotional ones. The court valued intensity of feeling as the source of great poetry, valued the capacity for deep emotion as the mark of a refined and cultivated person, valued the sensitivity to beauty and to loss that the greatest art required, and Rokujo no Miyasudokuro had all of this in abundance, was in these terms among the most highly cultivated people, at a court of highly cultivated people. But the cultivation of feeling as an aesthetic resource and the accommodation of feeling as a human reality are not the same thing, and the court that celebrated the first was not always equipped to provide the second, and Rokujo no Miyasudokuro's story is in part the story of this gap, the gap between the world's appreciation of what her feelings produced in its highest forms, and its incapacity to receive the feelings themselves in their full force. Genji appreciated her poetry, he appreciated her music, he appreciated the precision and the beauty with which she managed every occasion, and he was not capable of giving her what the appreciation of all these things might have suggested he would give her, which was a love adequate to what the gifts expressed, a commitment corresponding to the depth that the art made visible. The appreciation and the incapacity coexisted in him without apparent contradiction, and this coexistence is one of the most honest things about his characterization, one of the ways in which the tale of Genji refuses the simpler narrative in which the failure to love adequately is a mark of simple indifference or simple cruelty. He was not indifferent to her. He was not cruel to her. He was genuinely moved by what she was, and genuinely incapable of giving her what she needed, and the gap between the genuine feeling and the genuine incapacity is where the tragedy lives, not in the simple opposition of love and its absence, but in the complicated territory where love is present and still insufficient. This is the territory that Murasaki Shikibu was most interested in, the territory where good intentions and genuine feeling are not enough, where the person who causes harm is also a person who feels and regrets, where the complexity of the situation refuses to resolve into any simpler moral than the complexity itself. Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro lived in this territory from the beginning of her connection with Genji to the end, navigated it with the intelligence and the pride and the art that were her defining qualities, and found in the end that none of those qualities, however exceptional, were sufficient to prevent the consequences that the territory produced. Her story is not a story with a lesson in the simple sense, not a story from which a reader can extract a principle that will prevent the same situation from arising again, because the situation it describes is not the result of a mistake that could have been avoided with better judgment or better behavior, but the result of what certain people are and what certain worlds are, and the consequences that follow when those people inhabit those worlds and try to love each other within them. What it offers instead of a lesson is a truth, the truth of a specific experience rendered with extraordinary honesty and extraordinary precision, and the truth does what truth does, which is to illuminate something about the nature of experience itself that the person who encounters it recognizes as genuine, as corresponding to something they know from the inside, even if they have not lived the specific situation the truth describes. The Lady of Rokujo, she loved completely. She was not loved in return with equal completeness. She did not forgive it. She became the flame, and the world that her flame touched was never quite the same afterward, never quite as comfortable in its management of surfaces, never quite as able to believe that what lies beneath the surface can be fully contained by the arts of concealment and expression that the surface requires. She made the depths visible, though not in the way she would have chosen, and the visibility she created has lasted longer than anything else about her, longer than the beauty of her poems, or the precision of her social gifts, or the pride that was both her greatest defense and the source of her greatest vulnerability. She is still visible in the pages of the book that contains her, more than 1,000 years after she was created, and the visibility is not simply the visibility of a character in a story, but the visibility of a truth about human experience that the story was created to express, and that the expression has kept alive through all the centuries of reading that have passed since it was first written. Part 5. After Genji himself was gone, after the shining Miko had withdrawn from the world he had illuminated and complicated in equal measure, the world of the tale continued, organized now around different people and different configurations of feeling, and the question of what Rokujo Nomiya Sudokuro's legacy meant for those who came after entered a new phase, more distant from its origin, but no less consequential for that distance. The section of the Tale of Genji that takes place after Genji's death the section known as the Uji chapters after the location where much of the action occurs, is a different kind of story from what preceded it, darker and more austere in its emotional texture, less given to the brightness that Genji's presence had shed over everything he touched, more interested in the ways that the inheritance of the past shapes the possibilities of the future. The characters who inhabit the Uji chapters, the young men Kaoru and Nioinomiya, and the young women they become entangled with, the sisters Oigimi and Nakanokimi, and the figure of Ukihune, who is at the center of the most intense drama, are in various ways shaped by what has come before them, by the world that Genji made, and the legacies that his life and the lives of the women around him left behind. Kaoru is Genji's putative son, raised as such, but the tale makes clear that he is not Genji's biological child, that his actual father was a man who had had an affair with Onna Sanomiya, the woman who had been possessed by the spirit of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, and who had taken religious vows in the aftermath of that possession. Kaoru carries within him, without fully understanding it, the consequence of that history, the weight of a conception that was itself a product of the complicated forces that Miyasudokoro's spirit had set in motion. He is a serious and melancholy young man, drawn to the religious and the contemplative, aware of a weight in his own nature that he cannot fully account for, a weight that the narrative connects, without stating it directly, to the circumstances of his origin, and to the unresolved forces that those circumstances embodied. He is drawn to the daughters of Miko at Uji, to Oigimi the elder sister who refuses him with a consistency and a finality that his persistence cannot overcome, and to Nakanokimi the younger sister who marries Nioinomiya and navigates her own complicated situation. The refusal of Oigimi is one of the most interesting elements of the Uji chapters, a refusal that is not simply the conventional modesty of a young woman resisting an unwanted attachment, but something more deliberate and more philosophical, a refusal grounded in a genuine sense that the entanglement of love brings more suffering than it brings happiness, and that the wisest response to the possibility of love is to decline it entirely rather than to risk what the decline might prevent. There is something in Oigimi's refusal that resonates with the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, though the connection is not direct and the circumstances are very different. Both women are faced with a love that is offered genuinely, but that the woman cannot trust to be returned in the measure required, and both women respond with a withdrawal that is more complete than the circumstances strictly require, a withdrawal that goes beyond the management of a specific situation to something more fundamental about the relationship between the self and the world. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro's withdrawal was from Genji, from the court, from the capital, a physical and emotional withdrawal that preserved what remained of her dignity and her sense of self after the humiliation of the festival and the horror of the possession. Oigimi's withdrawal is more radical, a withdrawal from the possibility of love itself, from the vulnerability that love requires, from the exposure that even the hope of being loved creates. And Oigimi's withdrawal ends in her death, not a dramatic death in the manner of the possession's victims, but a quiet and deliberate fading, a refusal of the food and the care that would have sustained her life, a dying that has the quality of a choice made calmly and maintained with the same steadiness that her refusal of Kaoru had always maintained. The echo of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro in Oigimi's story is not the echo of a ghost or a direct spiritual influence, but something more diffuse, the echo of a pattern, of the way that certain kinds of feeling and certain kinds of world create certain kinds of outcomes, the way that the refusal to be loved inadequately can become, in certain circumstances, the refusal to be loved at all. Ukihune is the figure in the Uji chapters who most directly experiences the consequences of being desired by two men simultaneously, of being the object of both Kaoru's earnest and melancholy attention, and Nioinomiya's more impulsive and less responsible passion, and her experience has a quality that echoes, in a different register, the experience of the women in Genji's life who found themselves competing for a position that could not be fully shared. She is a young woman of modest origins compared to the sisters, brought into the Uji world through complicated family connections, and she is less equipped than Oigimi or Nakanokimi to navigate the demands of the situation she finds herself in, less able to maintain the composure that the court culture prescribed for young women managing difficult attachments. What happens to Ukihune is one of the most extraordinary sequences in the Uji chapters, a sequence that connects directly to the themes established by the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, in which the pressure of her situation becomes unbearable, and she walks into the river at Uji in the river at Uji, and is found on the riverbank, and undergoes what the narrative presents as a kind of spiritual crisis, a possession by forces that the ordinary world cannot account for, before eventually taking religious vows and withdrawing from the world entirely. The possession that Ukihune experiences has a different quality from the possessions attributed to Miyasudokoro's spirit earlier in the tale, is less clearly connected to a specific spiritual source, but it belongs to the same imaginative world, the world in which the intensity of feeling can exceed the capacity of the self to contain it, and can manifest in ways that bypass the ordinary channels of volition and action. Ukihune's survival and her eventual withdrawal into religious life is one of the ways in which the Uji chapters depart from the pattern established in the main body of the tale, where the women most affected by the consequences of love's inadequacy do not always survive, where Rokujo no Miyasudokoro dies and Aoi dies, and even Murasaki, the woman most central to Genji's later life, does not ultimately survive the accumulated weight of what she has experienced. Ukihune survives, and her survival has a different quality from the survival that simply continues a life in the world, a quality of having passed through something and emerged on the other side changed, committed to a form of life that removes her from the entanglements that brought her to the river at Uji, and that offers in their place a different kind of existence, quieter and more austere and oriented towards something other than the complicated negotiations of love and rank and position that the court world required. There is a question that the Uji chapters leave open, that the Tale of Genji leaves open, which is whether this withdrawal is a resolution or simply a different form of the same refusal that Oigimi embodied, whether the religious life that Ukihune chooses represents a genuine peace, or simply the most complete available form of the withdrawal from the risk of feeling that the experience of love's inadequacy can generate. The tale does not answer this question. ends before it can be answered, ends with Ukihune in her retreat, and Kaoru having discovered that she is alive and attempting to contact her, and Ukihune declining, through the intermediaries available to her, to acknowledge him, to allow the connection to be re-established, to re-enter the world that had brought her to the river. Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro casts her shadow over all of this, not as a direct presence, but as the originating figure in a pattern that the tale traces across generations and across different configurations of the fundamental situation, which is the situation of feeling that is given more completely than it is received, and the consequences that this incompleteness generates. She was the most extreme case, the figure in whom the consequences were most dramatically manifested, in whom the living spirit was most clearly the expression of feelings that had nowhere else to go, in whom the gap between what was given and what was returned was most fully and most honestly explored. But she was not the only case, and the Uji chapters, by following the consequences of the world she inhabited into the generation after Genji, suggests that what she embodied was not simply a personal tragedy, but something more systemic, something about the structure of the world that the tale depicts, and the kinds of outcomes that structure reliably produces. The women of the Uji chapters, Oigimi and Nakanokimi and Ukihune, are all in various ways negotiating the same fundamental situation that Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro negotiated before them, the situation of being women in a world that does not always know how to receive what women have to give, that offers love imperfectly, and expects the imperfection to be absorbed without remainder. The Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro's response to this situation was the most powerful and the most dangerous, the living spirit that could not be recalled, and that continued to act in the world after her death. The responses of the Uji women are differently shaped, are less dramatic in their external manifestations, but no less complete in their inner logic, and they share with Miyasu Dokuro's response the quality of refusing to pretend that the inadequacy is adequate, refusing to absorb what cannot be absorbed without remainder, and present a face of acceptance to the world. The Lady of Rokujo, she did not forgive. She became the flame, and the flame, long after the woman who kindled it was gone, continued to burn in the world she had left behind, continued to illuminate and to sear, continued to make visible what would otherwise have remained hidden, the full cost of love imperfectly given and imperfectly received, the full complexity of what it means to feel with completeness in a world that cannot always match it. Her story is not a comfortable story. It was not meant to be. It is a story about the consequences of feeling, about the way that the most human thing in us, the capacity for love, can become the most dangerous thing in us when the world around us cannot receive it in the measure we offer it, and about the way that the consequences of that failure persist in the world long after the feeling that generated them has passed. She was not forgiven, and she did not forgive, and she is not forgotten, and the not forgetting is itself a form of the justice that the world she lived in could not provide. The literature that followed the tale of Genji in the Japanese tradition has returned again and again to the figure of the woman whose feelings exceed the world's capacity to receive them, and each return has found in the original something new to illuminate. The No Theater took Rokujo no Miyasu Dokuro as one of its central subjects, and the plays built around her story are among the most powerful in the repertoire. Plays in which the figure of the jealous spirit is not simply a supernatural phenomenon, but a meditation on the nature of feeling and its consequences, on the way that love and grief and rage can persist beyond the ordinary boundaries of the self. In the no play called Aoi Noe, the play of Lady Aoi, the spirit of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro appears as a force that possesses the suffering Aoi, that speaks through her of the love that was not returned and the humiliation that was not forgiven, and the play does not resolve this into a simple moral about jealousy, but holds it in the full complexity of what it actually is, a force generated by love and by its inadequate return. The centuries that have passed since Murasaki Shikibu wrote the Tale of Genji have not simplified Rokujo no Miyasudokoro, have not made her easier to understand or more comfortable to contemplate, and this resistance to simplification is itself evidence of the depth and the honesty with which she was created, of the degree to which the figure reaches something true about human experience that cannot be reduced to any simpler formulation. She is a figure of love and a figure of horror, a figure of immense dignity and a figure of devastating force, a figure who commands both sympathy and something approaching fear, and the capacity to hold all of these things simultaneously is the mark of a character created with the full complexity that the experience she embodies actually contains. The world she lived in was a world of extraordinary refinement and extraordinary constraint, a world in which the expression of the inner life was both highly valued and highly controlled, and the story of Rokujo no Miyasudokoro is the story of what happens when the concealment fails, when the control is overwhelmed by the force it is attempting to contain, when the feeling that the art is trying to shape exceeds the art's capacity to shape it. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro's living spirit is the metaphor that Heian imagination used to name this excess, to make visible the force that feeling generates when it has nowhere else to go, and it is a metaphor of extraordinary power, precisely because within the imaginative world of the tale, it is also a literal reality, a thing that actually happens, that actually affects the people it encounters, that actually persists after the death of the person who generated it, by making the feelings real in the world, by giving them a force that acts on others and produces consequences that others have to live with. Murasaki Shikibu made an argument about the nature of feeling itself, about the way that what we feel does not stay within us, but moves through the world and affects others, whether we intend it to or not. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro was not fully aware, for some time, of what her spirit was doing. She had the dreams, and the unease, and the frightening recognition that something of her was leaving her body and going somewhere. But when the full nature of what was happening became clear, it was already too late to undo what had been done. This unknowing is one of the most important elements of her story, because it removes the simple moral of intentional wrongdoing and replaces it with something more complicated and more honest, the situation of a person who causes harm without fully intending it, who is the instrument of a force generated by her own feelings, but not fully under her control. She suffered, and she caused suffering, and she knew both, and she carried both, and she was neither simply a victim nor simply a villain, and the refusal to resolve her into either of those simpler categories is the most honest thing about her and the most enduring thing about the story that contains her. The river at Uji flows still, in the world and in the imagination, and the women who came to its banks in the later chapters of the tale are still there in the pages of the book, still navigating the situation that the structure of their world created for them, still refusing in their different ways to pretend that the inadequacy is adequate. Ukihune at the edge of the water, Oigimi fading quietly into her refusal, Nakanokimi managing with the practical intelligence of someone who has decided that survival is the best available form of resistance. They are all in some way the daughters of Rokujo no Miyasudokuro, not literally, but in the sense that they inhabit the world that her story helped to create. Rokujo no Miyasudokuro asked the question of how to live with feelings that the world cannot fully receive, and she asked it first, and most completely, and most devastatingly, and the asking has not been exhausted in the 1,000 years since the question was first put into the precise and beautiful language of the world's first great novel. She loved completely. She was not loved in return with equal completeness. She did not forgive it. She became the flame, and the flame burns still, in the pages of the book and in the imagination of everyone who has encountered her there, the woman whose feelings exceeded the world's capacity to receive them, who is not forgotten, and who will not be. The pattern that Rokujo no Miyasudokuro established in the world of the tale, the pattern of feeling that exceeds the capacity of the world to receive it, and that finds its own outlet when the ordinary channels are blocked, is a pattern that the Uji chapters trace into the generation that follows Genji, and the tracing makes visible something about the nature of inheritance that is not simply biological, but emotional. The way that the unresolved feelings of one generation create the emotional landscape that the next generation must navigate. Kaoru moves through that landscape with the melancholy of someone who senses the weight of what he has inherited without fully understanding its source, who carries a gravity that his circumstances do not entirely explain, and that his own reflection on those circumstances does not quite reach the bottom of. He is drawn to women who withdraw, drawn to the refusal that Oigimi embodies, and whether this is because the refusal resonates with something in his own nature, or because Miyasudokuro's spirit, in some attenuated form, continues to shape the emotional configurations of the world he inhabits, the tale does not say clearly. What it shows instead is the pattern itself, the repetition across generations and circumstances of the fundamental situation in which feeling exceeds the capacity of the world to receive it, in which love is offered more completely than it is returned, in which the person who feels most deeply is the person most at risk of the consequences of that depth. The Uji chapters are darker than what precedes them, and the darkness comes not simply from the loss of Genji and the diminishment of the world that his presence illuminated, but from something more fundamental, which is the sense that the world the tale depicts has reached a point where the ordinary human resources of love and beauty and art are not sufficient to address what has been accumulated, that the weight of the unresolved past is too great for the present to simply continue as though it were not there. Ukihune's crisis at the river is the most extreme manifestation of this weight in the Uji chapters, the moment at which the accumulated pressure of being desired by two men and belonging fully to neither, of being caught between competing claims that she has no adequate framework for resolving, produces in her the same kind of excess that Miyasudokoro's feeling produced, the same overflow of what cannot be contained through the ordinary channels of will and art and social management. She survives, unlike Miyasudokoro's victims, and her survival leads to a form of life that removes her from the world where the pressure was generated, the religious life that is in some sense the most complete form of the withdrawal that Miyasudokoro chose when she went to Issei, the removal not simply from one man or one court, but from the whole structure of the world that makes such situations possible. Whether this removal constitutes a resolution or simply a different relationship to the unresolvable is one of the questions the tale ends with, and it ends with it because it is a genuine question, not one that the tale has an answer to, but one that the experience of the characters makes unavoidable. Rokujo no Miyasudokoro did not withdraw into religious life. She went to Issei and returned, and between the going and the returning and the dying that followed, she continued to be present in the world, continued to feel what she felt, continued to generate the force that her feeling produced, and continued to act in the world through that force even after the body that housed it was gone. Her persistence is the thing that makes her story most different from the stories of the women who came after her, from Oigimi's quiet refusal and Ukihune's crisis and withdrawal. The thing that distinguishes her as the figure in whom the consequences of feeling are most dramatically and most completely rendered. She did not withdraw from the world. She was present in it, fully and at great cost, to the end, and the presence was the presence of someone who would not diminish herself by pretending that what she felt was not what she felt, who would not manage the surface at the expense of the reality that the surface was managing, whose pride was ultimately the pride of someone who refused the comfort of the false resolution, who insisted on the full complexity of her own experience, even when that insistence produced consequences she would not have chosen. This insistence is what makes her great, in the sense that tragic figures are great, in the sense that the person who faces the full cost of what they are, and what they feel without flinching, is in some way admirable, even when what they are and what they feel produces harm, even when the facing without flinching is itself a form of damage to themselves and to others. The Lady of Rokujo, the woman whose love was not returned in the measure it was given, the woman whose spirit left her body and went where it went and did what it did, because there was nowhere else for the feeling to go, the woman who knew what had happened and carried the knowledge to her death, the woman whose spirit continued after her death to make present in the world the feeling that her life had not been able to resolve. She is the most honest figure in the most honest account of love that the literature of any culture has produced, and the honesty of her rendering is the greatest gift that Murasaki Shikibu gave to everyone who has read the tale in the 1,000 years since it was written, the gift of a truth about the experience of loving and being loved imperfectly that no simpler or more comfortable account of that experience could have provided. The flame she became burns still, in the pages of the book, in the imagination of everyone who has encountered her there, in the world that continues to produce the situations her story describes, the situations in which feeling exceeds the capacity of the world to receive it, in which love is given more completely than it is returned, in which the consequences of that incompleteness persist long after the circumstances that generated it have passed. She loved. She was not fully loved in return. She did not forgive it. She became the flame, and the flame, 1,000 years later, has not gone out.